Hello, everybody. I'm Krista Ducker from the Dakotas Conference. I'm a licensed local pastor, as well as a participant in the Kairos Project through Sioux Falls Seminary, as a mentor and as a student in the Master of Divinity program. So good to see you, and I look forward to diving into this question for our forum. Is there a new role for lay leadership? Great question. I've had a lot of fun looking into it. A little bit of a disclaimer before we start. I am not a lifelong Methodist, so some of this stuff may be newer to me than it is to some of you, and I welcome the dialogue. Please do set me straight if I get off track. First of all, I want to just let you know the sources I'm using. Of course, the Book of Discipline, a couple of sections there, section 2, paragraphs 126 to 134, and section 11, paragraphs 266 to 269, as well as the 2018 Lay Servant Ministries Equipping Resources, Virginia Conference Board of Laity, Characteristics of Effective Lay Leadership in the Churches of the Virginia Conference, and 2 books, Fellowship of Love, which is part of our book review that we'll be handing in, as well as the article, which is the basis for this question. Is there a new role for lay leadership in Questions for the 21st Century Church? So we'll start out, of course, with the Book of Discipline, talking about the role of lay leadership according to our governing document. So here's, to give us a big picture, we can start with section 2, paragraphs 126 to 134. Now, before we do that, I will just say my response to this question is kind of a yes and no. We'll get into that. I think there may be a recovery of an old role that we need to remember as Methodist laity, so we'll get to that. But first of all, just want to look at some definitions here. In a section called The Ministry of All Christians, it's part 4 in the Book of Discipline, particularly section 2, but it starts out in section 1 talking about the mission of the church, which we all know is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And we are, as both clergy and laity and everything in between, we are called to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. That's our call as United Methodists. So as we look at the part 2 of this, the ministry of all Christians, there is an overarching argument here presented by the church that there is a ministry to which we all are called. The heart of Christian ministry is Christ's ministry of outreaching love. I can totally get behind that. It's the expression of the mind and mission of Christ by a community of Christians that demonstrates a common life of gratitude and devotion, witness and service, celebration, and discipleship. Within that, the ministry of the laity flows from a commitment to that love. Lay members are by history called active advocates of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Every layperson is called to carry out the Great Commission. Every layperson is called to be missional. The witness of the laity, their Christ-like examples of everyday living, as well as the sharing of their own faith experiences of the gospel, is the primary evangelistic ministry through which all people will come to know Christ. And the United Methodist Church will fulfill its mission. Notice that it is the primary evangelistic ministry for everybody, right? Not just pastors. The laity as well are engaged in this missional ministry of love through Christ's Church, the United Methodist Church. So that talks a little bit about the laity, and there's a lot more in this section, but we don't have a lot of time, so I'll let you look at that. That is a great description of what it means to be a lay person in the United Methodist Church. And again, as a Christian, we all have this mission. So it was really helpful to me after I read this to look at the Virginia document, Characteristics of Effective Lay Leadership in the Churches of the Virginia Conference. It's almost like it just expounds upon that paragraph and gives us more details. What does an effective lay leader look like? Well, it's someone who recognizes that commitment to Jesus Christ is the foundation for all leadership in the church. They recognize making disciples of Jesus as the primary goal of the church and of Christians. They seek to respond to conflict as Jesus did, directly, openly, and responsible, treating others with respect and seeking justice, healthy accountability, and reconciliation. Recognize the importance of character. They pursue spiritual growth and renewal of body, mind, and spirit, and they seek to be servant leaders, another thing that's discussed a little bit later on in section 2 of the Book of Discipline. So this is, and I would read the whole thing if I had time, but it is a wonderful sort of fleshing out of what paragraph 127 of section 2 of the Book of Discipline says about the mission and ministry of the laity. And I can see that. We'll discuss in a little bit how that has played out in the past. And it is a powerful office to hold, one of the laity in the United Methodist Church. So that's one aspect of it. And I wanted to look a little bit more into what else the Book of Discipline has to say about laity. And what I discovered, as I have kind of heard about before but never really delved into deeply, is that there's another category of laity. You've kind of got everybody, and then within everybody, you have another category called certified laity. Okay, so we find that in the Book of Discipline, section 11, paragraphs 206 to 209. So if we look at that, we realize there's actually different categories of laity. The first one should say certified lay servant. My apologies, that's a typo. But what we find if we were to look in that section of the Book of Discipline is a lot of regulations that apparently will certify certain lay people as either certified servants, speakers, or ministers. So you can look in the Book of Discipline in that section. What I found was really helpful in kind of summarizing it in a way that's a little easier to understand is the Lay Servant 2018 Handbook, which is one of the handouts that we have in class here. And I won't go through all the details, but there's a lot. In order to be a lay servant, you've got to obtain recommendation. You have to complete a course. You have to complete another advanced lay ministries course. You have to apply and have your qualifications reviewed. And then you have to maintain it every year by submitting an annual report and an application, and then obtaining recommendation every year. And then every 3 years, completing an advanced course. So that's for the certified lay servant. If you want to be a lay speaker, you have to do that, plus take a bunch of other courses, 7 other courses on prayer, worship, spiritual gifts, preaching, United Methodist heritage and polity, etc. Similarly, you have similar requirements to be a certified lay minister. Okay, so that's to be a certified lay person over against regular lay people, I guess, is the way I understand that. It was interesting because at the last annual conference that I went to just a couple weeks ago, I talked with a licensed local pastor, and her words to me were, you know, I was going through the certification process and I thought about becoming a certified lay minister. But when I looked at all the classes I had to take, I thought I might as well just become a licensed local pastor. So it was interesting to me that she said that, and then to read through these qualifications, it completely makes sense. And it seemed to me as I was looking through all of these qualifications that there's perhaps a bit of a need to control what the Holy Spirit is about. Now, standards are a good thing. I'm not saying they're not, but it almost began to seem cumbersome and burdensome, just the level of stuff and hoops that people have to go through just to receive this certification in order to do probably stuff that they're already doing. So it was just curious to me. And I wondered whether in going through all of these hoops, it's a way to sort of hold down the Holy Spirit a little bit. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. What I want to do now is ask a question of us as pastors. When I look at this Virginia conference document, and I look at that section 2 of the Book of Discipline, I wonder how we're doing as a church in cultivating discipleship of the kind that creates or forms by the Holy Spirit's guidance and direction people who look like this. And I felt myself feeling convicted that perhaps all too often I participate in creating Christian leaders who are more like Christian consumers and less like servant leaders. So that's something that's going to stick with me as I go through and continue to try to internalize and what I'm learning in this class. You know, are we training Christian leaders or Christian consumers? What does it look like? And how can we recover something of what we've seen in the past? So I think that I'm curious about this sort of distinction between the regular laity and the certified laity and what that means and how it works out in practice. So I'd love your input on that. But what I want to do in terms of asking the question again, is there a new role for laity in the 21st century United Methodist Church? So I want to go back and look at our history a little bit, which is why I wanted to bring us to these two books, Questions for the 21st Century Church, the article that posits this question, and then Fellowship of Love from Alice Knotts. So both of these books describe primarily female-led movements of laity that went around the current regulations of their day to effectively call the institution of the United Methodist Church to recover its moral compass. In one case, in the article from Questions from the 21st Century Church, it was a movement around ministering to the indigent and those who were struggling in urban settings. And then, of course, in Alice Knott's book, it was around racial attitudes and the segregation of the United Methodist Church in the central jurisdiction. And in a sense, these were female-led movements, partly perhaps because women didn't really have another choice until 1956. They could not be ordained. They weren't granted full clergy rights until then. So for much of the civil rights struggle, women were finding other ways to do what they felt called to do. And so they found a way as laity to mobilize this movement that eventually turned the United Methodist ship toward justice. And I found a really helpful definition that Alice Knotts gives and a distinction between movements and institutions. And I think that will be helpful in our conversation. So Alice Knotts distinguishes in her book between movements that act more quickly, take more risks, and involve masses of people and obtain more immediate results, with institutions that may sustain an effort over a long time, ultimately making significant progress. Both move toward justice, but they do it differently. Movements act quickly, they obtain more immediate results. Institutions may sustain a longer effort and make significant progress over the long haul. So that's the difference between the two. And what we see, particularly in the movements of Methodist women changing racial attitudes in the United Methodist Church in the early to mid 20th century, is a relationship of accountability between the movement of laity they represented and the institution of the United Methodist Church that resulted in positive change in the desegregation of the jurisdictional conferences of the church. So in effect, these movements of laity, one a movement serving the indigent and destitute in America's inner cities, and the other mobilized to desegregate the United Methodist Church, demonstrated moral leadership, which Sarah Kreutzinger quotes from Carol Becker to be being ourselves boldly. I love that. Moral leadership means being ourselves boldly. So I would perhaps reframe the question and ask another one. How can we empower our lay leadership to be themselves boldly as moral leaders, to be formed in discipleship into the image of Christ, and to just be themselves boldly? See, I believe that there is a role for lay leadership, but not a new one. It's an old one that perhaps needs to be recovered. And I would even argue that training for certification, and even perhaps the process and the idea of certification, perhaps could be rethought in a way that is sensitive to the unique journeys of our lay leaders, so that it's manageable and realistic for them and relevant, and also is not a burden, and to be empowering rather than stifling, perhaps to address the certification process, whatever that means, first by saying, okay, so what is God already doing in the lives of our leaders who are already serving and thus have come up to our vision as people who could be certified? What is God already doing and how can we help them? Another way to say it is that I don't think lay leaders are pastors light. It almost feels like a lot of the coursework is kind of like a little mini seminary for our lay leaders. And we need to ask the question, are we training them to be mini pastors, or are we training them to be empowered laity? And is there a difference? What does that look like? So I believe that, as Sarah Kreutzinger says in her article, that lay leader certification training should be evaluated by laity in conjunction with the conference, so that it's not burdensome, but helpful and productive in training people in whom the Spirit is already at work to be even more effective in their leadership, trusting that we are joining into a process that the Holy Spirit has begun. We're not making them into servant leaders, they already are. We're just helping them be more effective at that. Right? So here are some discussion questions that, that came to mind for me, and I really am curious about your responses. There is also the default, where have I gone off track? Can you help me with that? If I have, but here are the actual 3 forum questions. So are the current requirements for servant lay leaders, speakers, or servant speakers and ministers helpful? If not, what might an alternative model look like? How can the United Methodist denomination encourage laity to be themselves boldly within a Wesleyan framework? Second, and this is a powerful one for me, I really want to know what you have to say. How can we move from training Christian consumers to servant leaders in our congregations? For this, I was inspired by the Virginia Conference, Characteristics of Effective Leadership. And how have you seen this worked out in your context? Do you have any stories to tell? Third question, can the laity function as a movement within the institution of the United Methodist denomination as it did in the mid-20th century around the issue of segregation, and how? So for that, we're going to go back to this definition. The distinction between movements that act more quickly, take more risks, involve masses of people, and obtain more immediate results, and institutions that may sustain an effort over a long time, ultimately making significant progress. I've been inspired as I've learned more about the United Methodist response to racism, slavery, segregation, and gender, that in the past, these movements of laity have helped to slowly turn the ship of United Methodism toward justice. And I think that that could be a very important function of the laity, especially now in the current debates that we are facing, particularly around human sexuality and gender identity. So just interested in your questions on that. Again, I'm really thankful for this opportunity and to hear from you. So God bless. Take care.